Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight for our devotions. I want to read tonight the first 14 verses of Psalm 10, and beginning at verse 1, it says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor. Let them be caught in the schemes that they have devised. For the wicked boasts of the desires of his soul, and the one greedy for gain curses and renounces the Lord. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. He says in his heart, I shall not be moved. Throughout all generations I shall not meet adversity. His mouth is filled with cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue are mischief and iniquity. He sits in ambush in the villages. In hiding places he murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in its thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws them into his net. The helpless are crushed, sunk down, and fall by his might. He says in his heart, God is forgotten. He's hidden his face. He'll never see it. Arise, Lord. O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the afflicted. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? But you do see, for you note mischief and vexation, that you may take it into your hands. To you the helpless commits himself. You have been the helper of the fatherless." Well, as I said yesterday, this psalm is very closely linked to the previous psalm, not only in its structure but in its thematic content, focusing as it does on the apparent escape from justice that the wicked seem to enjoy and the ultimate judgment and justice of God. The psalm is in three sections. Verses 1 and 2 open the psalm as a lament. Verses 3 to 11 describe the circumstances that have led to this lament, and verses 12 to 18 are an intercession calling on God to prove the wicked wrong. We have already noted in an earlier devotion that lament is a common feature in the Psalms, but it must be said that the lament in this psalm, the opening verses, are particularly abrupt. David abandons all the expected diplomacy and protocol when addressing God, and he gets straight to the point with a repeated why in verse 1. Dale Davis notes that the double why implies that as far as David is concerned, God is acting in a way that's out of character. As is clear from the rest of the psalm, the way things stand, it looks very much like the wicked are getting away with their wickedness, and that God is not lifting a finger to stop them. But we shouldn't read this why as an expression, a lack of faith. It's simply that David knows God. He's familiar with the ways of God, and so he is confused by God's apparent indifference to the plight of the poor and the oppressed. Yet, despite the dangerously impolite and almost accusing why, we should take some encouragement from David's bluntness. It suggests that we can come to prayer in God and express our frustrations with God's ways without fear. David models for us the right response when we don't understand what God has done or what God is doing, for he continues to plead his case before God. He seeks understanding, if not indeed a resolution. Far from disengaging with God, this lack of understanding drives him all the more closer to God to inquire of God. And that's good news for us, because sooner or later all of us will encounter what's been called the hiddenness of God. I know it's stating the obvious, but are we not all living through a period of time exactly like that, when God appears hidden? Are not we all caught up in this global pandemic with everyone else? Aren't we all suffering? Isn't it the case, however, that the rich and the powerful are suffering less, that they're coping with it better? Isn't it the case that some members of the government got a COVID-19 test in a fraction of the time it takes the rest of us? In fact, our health workers struggle to even get one. Studies have already shown that it is the poor, the disabled and the health compromised who are disproportionately suffering as a result of this pandemic. There's no shortage of preachers and religious pundits happy to tell us why God has brought this calamity on us. But I've said recently, despite that I really don't have any idea why God has brought this calamity on us, and I don't think anyone else has either. There's confusion, there's frustration, there's the question, why? And yet here is the mystery. For though God seems strangely hidden in these days, he is also intimately present. The key to making sense of this is perhaps in David's approach. He doesn't pretend that everything is okay or that he understands what God is doing, but in the midst of his confusion and frustration, he draws closer to God. David's lament is very personal in its nature. He's not asking some philosophical question. He's not posing an intellectual dilemma. It's a devotional issue, one that speaks to his own relationship with God. The fact is that the circumstances that David describes in this psalm are not all that uncommon. The wicked seem to prosper. They certainly oppress the poor. And it looks as though sometimes that God has turned a blind eye because he does nothing about it. David's lament, therefore, is in some way an attempt to remind God of what it is he's turning a blind eye to. And yet at the heart of this lament, this complaint, is the confidence in the justice of God that was central to Psalm 9. Notice in the middle section, David identifies the wicked as those who renounce the Lord. They don't seek him, and crucially in verse 11, they think that since God has done nothing, he mustn't see their wickedness and will therefore do nothing. Such arrogance reminds David of the extent of their folly, for he's already declared in Psalm 9 that God's throne is established forever for justice. In describing the behaviour of the wicked, David is moved to prayer, and it is as he prays that he gives voice to the hope that's rising within him. The wicked are wrong, for God notes their mischief. He notes the vexation of the poor. He takes it into his hands and commits himself to the helpless. So much for the wicked who think nothing can touch them. Just because God's judgment is delayed doesn't mean that it's not coming. Just because the wicked think they've gotten away with it and that they are invincible does not mean that God has not seen or heard and that he will not act. Even the things that they have done in secret have not gone unnoticed. For God says in Jeremiah 23 and verse 24, "Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them?" The answer, of course, is implied. No one. Thanks for listening.